Before the guillotine could claim her, Marie Antoinette faced a final deliberate act of cruelty designed to strip away everything that made her a queen, a mother and a woman. Her journey from Versailles' gilded halls to a bare wooden cart paraded through Paris wasn't just punishment. It was a psychological assault intended to erase her existence. And yet, despite months of calculated humiliation, she found a sliver of power in her last hours. This is the story of how they tried to destroy Marie Antoinette, and how, even in utter degradation, she regained her dignity. Forget the sparkling salons of Versailles. This story begins in the damp, stinking cell of the Conciergerie, a grim fortress nicknamed the Antechamber to the Guillotine. By August 2nd, 1793, Marie Antoinette had already spent months in imprisonment alongside her family, stripped of her crown and wealth. That night, she was torn from her children and her sister-in-law and brought here alone to a room that would be her world for the next 76 days. In this cell, she was no longer a queen. She became prisoner number 2, Cho, the space wasteny, filthy, with walls that leaked and a straw mattress barely enough to call a bed. Privacy didn't exist. 2 guards were posted in her cell 24/7, eyes fixed on every movement. They watched her eat, watched her dress behind a flimsy screen, watched her try to sleep. The surveillance wasn't just intimidation, it was a methodical attack on her humanity. A reminder that the privileges of royalty were gone forever. The physical misery was brutal, but nothing compared to the psychological torment just a month earlier. Guards had stormed her room in the dead of night to seize her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. Accounts describe Marinette throwing herself between her son and the men, screaming, pleading. Her daughter, Mars, clung to her brother, crying. They tore him away anyway. She would never see him alive again. All she had left was a tiny portrait and a lock of hair hidden in a corset. Losing the crown was secondary. Losing her child shattered her in a way no execution could. Her maid, Rosalie Lamole, who remained with her through these last months, would later say the Queen's heart broke only when she spoke of her children. Every other humiliation, every insult seemed almost tolerable compared to that grief. By mid-October, the final act of her ordeal began. On October 14, 1793, Marie Antoinette faced a revolutionary tribunal. This was no real trial, just a performance scripted by her political enemies. And like her husband Louis XVI, who had weeks to mount a defense, she had less than a day. The charges were absurd, a mix of political accusation and grotesque fantasy lifted from slanderous pamphlets that had haunted her for years. She was accused of funneling money to Austria, plotting massacres, and hosting depraved orgies at Versailles. And then there was the most poisonous accusation of all, one designed to annihilate her very character, incest with her own son. They forced young Louis Charles to sign a statement against her. The courtroom fell silent as Marie Antoinette absorbed the claim. The prosecution, led by Theséalotte Antoine Quentin Forquier Tinville, seemed almost giddy at the cruelty. For a moment she didn't speak. The room buzzed with tension. Then she rose, not to plead, not to beg, but to confront this last monstrous lie with a presence that shocked everyone watching. Her defiance wasn't theatrical. It was precise. She turned to the gallery, Heres scanning the faces of Parisian women who had once shouted for her death. And in that single bold gesture, she reminded them and the world that she was a mother first, a woman defending her honor. The trial was over quickly. On October 16th, after barely 2 days, the male jury declared her guilty of high treason, death by guillotine. When asked for her last words, Marie Antoinette simply shook her head. Back in her cell, she refused a final meal. Calmly, she told Rosalie, "I need nothing now. My child, it's all over for me." Then she wrote a heartbreaking letter to her sister-in-law, pleading that her son be forgiven for the forced testimony he had given against her. The letter was intercepted and only discovered years later. With dawn came the next wave of humiliation, meticulously planned. Guards ordered her to remove the black mourning dress she had worn since Louis XVI's execution. a garment that had symbolized her status and her history. In its place, they forced her into a tattered white shirt, the attire of a penitent, not a queen. She had to beg for a moment's privacy just to dress. When her captives ignored her protest, she refused to comply immediately, a small act of control in a day designed to strip her of any autonomy. The executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, and his assistants took further steps to dehumanize her. One assistant grabbed her hair, already prematurely white from stress, and cut it with crude scissors. It was a symbolic erasure of her femininity and rank, and a practical preparation for the guillotine. Her hands were bound behind her back with ropes, pulled so tight they caused real pain. Even basic bodily functions required permission, which she had torquessed with humility. She was led to a wooden cart, the kind used for common criminals. Unlike her husband, who had been given a closed carriage, she was exposed to the jeers and hatred of tens of thousands lining the streets. The parade to the Place de la Revolution would be more than an hour long, a public spectacle of degradation meant to crush her spirit. And yet, as she sat on that plank, hands tied, surrounded by hostility, Marie Antoinette endured every step. Every stare, every insult tested her, but she remained composed, aware that her final hours would define her more than any trial or punishment. The Queen of France had been stripped of her crown, her family and her palace, but in that damp cell and on the path to the guillotine, the seeds of her final unbroken dignity were already taking root. Marie Antoinette's silent defiance during this ride foreshadowed a final astonishing display of courage that would stun both the executioners and the spectators. The crowd's mood was volatile, swinging between satisfaction, hatred, and morbid curiosity. Some cheered, some spat, some simply stared. Every insult thrown was an attempt to crush her spirit before the blade could do its work. But with each lurch of the cart, each scream of the crowd, Marie Antoinette remained a singular, composed figure. A woman who had lost everything material, yet held on to her inner core. This hour-long procession through the heart of Paris was intended to humanize, to turn her into a symbol of the revolution's triumph over royalty. Yet ironically, it also cemented her legend. But for the quiet defiance, the unshakable dignity, and the motherly courage she displayed in her final public moments. By the time the cart reached the Place Revolution, Marie Antoinette had survived an ordeal that would have shattered any ordinary person. But as the guillotine came into view, she knew the next stage of humiliation awaited, a stage where she would face not just death, but the final test of her composure, her courage, and her humanity. Her story, however, was far from over. That final act, the walk up the wooden steps to the blade, would reveal a side of her that even their revolutionaries could not destroy. The Queen's capacity for grace, defiance, and a last hauntingly human act that would echo through history. But on that October day in 1793, it was a boiling cauldron of rage, curiosity, and bloodlust. In the center stood the guillotine, its wooden frame towering against the gray autumn sky, a silent predator waiting for its prey. The crowd surged like a living tide, tens of thousands strong, hungry for spectacle, eager for the fall of the Queen, who had become a symbol of everything they hated. Yet as the cart jerked to a stop, something unexpected happened. Marie Antoinette, who had been stripped of every luxury, every title, every piece of dignity, did not crumble. She stepped down with deliberate composure. Observers later described her as calm, almost elegant. Her hands were still bound. Her hair, once a crown of gold, had been hacked off. Every insult thrown at her, every jeer from the crowd seemed to roll off her shoulders. The wooden steps to the guillotine were waiting. It would have been easy, ordinary even, to collapse, to tremble, to scream. But she didn't. She climbed alone, refusing the executioner's hand, refusing the final act of subjugation. Every step was a silent defiance, a reminder that while they could end her life, they could not crush her spirit. And then, in a twist almost too surreal to believe, she stepped on the executioner's foot, Charles Henry Sanson, the man who had severed her hair, bound her hands, and now was seconds away from taking her life, flinched. The crowd's eyes fell on the moment, tense with anticipation. Marie Antoinette, without a hint of fear, whispered a quiet apology. "Forgive me, sir. I didn't mean to." That small act, mere seconds before death, was extraordinary. It was human. It was graceful. And it was defiant in the only way that mattered. She retained her dignity when all else had been stripped from her. The blade would take her life, but not her essence. At exactly 12:15 p.m., it happened. The guillotine fell swift, precise, final. The assistant held her severed head aloft, and the crowd erupted in a roar, chanting, "Long live the Republic!" The body was unceremoniously loaded onto a cart and dumped into an unmarked grave at a nearby cemetery. In death, they tried to reduce her to a common criminal, erasing the last Queen of France as if she had never existed. Yet history has a way of preserving what cruelty seeks to destroy. Even in death, Marie Antoinette's story refused to be silenced. One of the macabre tales that followed her was that of the young artist who would become Madame Tussaud. She was summoned to make a death mask of the Queen's severed head, a chilling reminder of the fascination and horror that Marie Antoinette inspired even in the moments after her life ended. It would take more than 20 years for her final chapter to be written. After the monarchy's restoration in 1815, King Louis XV ordered the exhumation of the remains of his brother and sister-in-law. Their clothing was identified, their bodies given a proper royal burial in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French royalty. Finally, the Queen, who had been publicly humiliated and executed as a commoner, was laid to rest with the dignity she had been denied in life. The French Revolution sought to destroy a symbol of wealth and excess. They subjected Marie Antoinette to every conceivable indignity: imprisonment, loss of her children, a sham trial, public humiliation, and finally a death meant to strip her of her very identity. They wanted the world to see a monster. Instead, they revealed a woman of remarkable endurance, courage, and unexpected grace. Her last moment contained acts of subtle defiance that history still remembers. The apology to her executioner, the refusal to collapse, the composure on the car as tens of thousands spat and jeered. All were demonstrations that even in the face of ultimate cruelty, she could assert control over her final narrative. They could take her crown. They could take her life. They could even strip her of hair, clothing, and dignity. But they could not erase the quiet strength, the motherly courage, and the haunting poise she displayed until the very end. The guillotine may have been swift, brutal, and public, but it could not sever her story from history. Accounts from witnesses, sketches by revolutionary artists, and later biographies ensured that the final Queen of France would not vanish into obscurity. The image that remained was not of a debauched, heartless woman, but of a mother, a prisoner, and a human being confronting death with extraordinary composure. Even centuries later, her story continues to captivate. It's not only the brutality of the French Revolution that people remember, but the way she faced it, dignity intact, humanity preserved. The world saw her executed, humiliated, stripped of everything. Yet they also saw a quiet rebellion, a refusal to let the tread and fear define her final moments. That final apology, a small, almost imperceptible act of kindness, became a symbol. She could die, but she could not be destroyed. The legend of Marie Antoinette isn't only about excess of monarchy. It is about survival, grace under pressure, and the human spirit's stubbornness in the face of dehumanization. Every cruel act, every humiliation intended to diminish her, instead, highlighted the strength that remained unbreakable. Even as the blade fell, her story refused to end with the revolution's violence. She was more than the sum of her misfortunes. She was a queen strict bare, a mother grieving for her child, a human being meeting death with dignity, and in that she left a legacy no guillotine could erase. The last Queen of France died as they intended, but in the hearts and minds of the witnesses and in the annals of history, Marie Antoinette remained untouchable. Thank you for watching. If you want to uncover more stories of power, betrayal, and survival from the darkest chapters of history, subscribe to Grim History and witness the human stories behind the events that shaped our world.